Thank you for joining us for the Veeam 100 show. My name is Karinne Bessette. I'm a technologist here at Veeam Software, and I have the absolute pleasure of hosting this with two of our Veeam 100 members. Would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself, Tom?
My name is Tom May. I'm the CEO of Different Dev, and I've been kicking around Veeam since about version 4. So I guess dinosaur status might apply.
Absolutely. And how about you, Jonah?
I am a product architect at CyberFortress, like you said, part of the Veeam 100. Haven't quite been around as long as Tom. I think I started right as 9.5 Update 3 released, but very active in the community in the last couple of years since then.
Absolutely. Now, we do have the community, which is our community hub, and all of our other avenues that we send out on. But there's something beyond just being part of the Veeam 100 community. You have to be involved in your job as well as Veeam itself. Can you give us a little bit of background of how you contribute to the Veeam community, Jonah?
Yes, of course. So I have my own blogging site that I run and post to periodically. I'm fairly active in the automation desk on the Veeam Community Hub, so posting some automated scripts there, as well as founding and helping organize the Veeam Community Hackathon this past year, which we should have some more information on for this year coming up in the next couple months. And in addition, I'm also now, as of actually last week, a VCSP Technical Ambassador.
That's fantastic. So yes, the hackathon was a wonderful experience, and I've just got out of some meetings that we are doing some planning behind the scenes, and we'll have some meetings in the coming weeks, and hopefully tune in, you guys listening here in the audience, on how you can participate. Now, Tom, can you give us a little bit of background of how you give back to the community?
Absolutely. I think I like to do vocal conduits, if you will. I spend a lot of time meeting with community members, maybe not so much on the technical side, but on the executive side. And I help bring in feedback cycles from the Veeam community into Veeam internal for product enhancements, wants, needs, desires. So that's a little bit of my specialty. I too was involved in the hackathon, not on a Jonah level, but perhaps I think they quoted me as saying the best team lead, because we had Veeam 1 and today we're going to look at Veeam 1 because it's just pure awesomeness. So that's a little bit of what I do.
That's a great cue to get started on our topic today. So, Veeam Beyond the Clicks. Now, this is a completely community-driven ask from Tom and Veeam. Can you give us some insights on where this title came from, what your thought process behind this entire concept was to begin with?
Absolutely. I'll jump in with this if you don't mind, Jonah. When Jonah and I were lurking about in the world, we noticed that a lot of the community in Veeam tends to be very, very technical. So we tend to deep dive into wonderful content in the V100. And I noticed this gap, if you will, where we were so focused on the tech, sometimes we were forgetting about the business process, the business continuity plans. And there seemed to be this gap when we spoke to different audiences. The technical folks ate up every little thing we were doing. The executives were kind of disjointed. They didn't really understand how Veeam tied back to their business. And I think it stems from talking to a lot of executives, especially in the cyber insurance arenas. Years ago, when we would help do folks work with folks for their cyber audits, for their cyber insurance, typically the question was asked, well, what do you do for backup in DR? And the answer could simply be Veeam. As we started progressing further along, what we noticed was the carriers were asking more in-depth questions, and it started having the executives ask many more questions. And we thought, rather than leave them kind of out in the dark, let's bring it back together. And of course, as we go through our careers, we start doing these interviews, and Jonah and I started realizing, why don't we fill in the gaps a little bit from the technical to the executive? So we really wanted to go Veeam Beyond the Clicks in that let's not just sit there in the VBR console or in Veeam 1, but let's bring that back to the business side, if you will. So a little bit of business analytics, if you will, is I think where this kind of went. And I'm excited. I think we get to take a little bit of a topic that might seem a little bit obvious, but do we really deep dive into it and do we bring it home? And so I'm really excited to move it beyond the clicks of the console. Jonah, do you want to add anything in there?
I'll just say that, on my side, I am with a cloud service provider. So we are going to be talking a lot more maybe on the on-premises and, like you said, executive or shareholder side of things. But as a cloud provider, that stuff is equally as important as the offsite, because if things are not functioning well on premises, things are not planned, you're not ready to roll during a disaster, it's going to affect your performance and recovery offsite to us as a cloud provider.
Fantastic. And let's go ahead and hop directly into our first topic here, which we have about efficiencies and optimizations. I'd say that's probably a big thing most companies are looking at, especially with the bottom line rounding up the year. Can you give us a little bit more insights here, Jonah?
I can. So, of course, to go beyond the clicks with Veeam, you have to start inside of Veeam because you have to have a base. So a big part of taking Veeam beyond the clicks is, like you said, starting with your performance, your feature set, your efficiency, your reliability, and essentially making sure that you have everything in place, including some of the latest product features, in order to make sure you don't have backup or restore bottlenecks and that everything will function properly when that time comes where you're in a disaster. And that as your data evolves on premises, your data protection plan evolves in conjunction with it, because it's a living, breathing component of your infrastructure.
Excellent. And then we have a little bit more insights. Would you like to add to that, Tom?
No, absolutely. I think I want to draw back to where Jonah was talking about being on the cloud provider side. I've lived in that world of that secondary environment or tertiary environment and bring it back to this maximize efficiency. I think this is critical in that if we get on-prem right, we get the cloud right. We get those alternate environments correct. And people tend to not think about that because of silos. People work on-prem, local IT teams, maybe a VASP like myself. We're just wrapped in this wrapper. And then folks like Jonah are sitting up in the cloud, and we kind of have three different arenas. And I think when we look at maximizing these efficiencies, we really have to remember how everything flows through, kind of that whole 3, 2, 1, 1, 1, 0 concept. While we have three copies of that data, they really are tied so close together. So it's important as we identify and eliminate those bottlenecks and really bring it into the scope of best practices, which I think we'll touch on a little bit later, and absolutely bringing about the reliability. From my standpoint, being on the VASP side, I try to remember, folks, it's really nice to have that recovery localized as close as we can to the source. And that's what this process comes to bring about. And we'll dive into a little bit more.
Absolutely. And I always love hearing what I like to refer to as the backup zip code. It is a great standard. And just a little bit more on what those additional numbers mean. If you haven't been on many of our webcasts, it's the traditional 3-2-1 rule for data resiliency, but you're also making sure that you have a locked copy of that data, a copy off site, as well as that locked copy, and doing some testing on that background. So a little bit about the cost savings and especially the security assurance with you, Tom.
Absolutely, cost savings. In IT, I think a lot of times when the IT groups come to the business, we always want more. We want more storage, we want more space, we want more bandwidth, and they look at us as we're just this huge cost center. And I think when we have the appropriate conversations about cost savings, it helps the business understand a little bit more of where we're going. And this I would put under really road mapping. Often in the community, when I speak to folks, they'll attend Veeam webinars, their sales folks will be involved, and we hear this full suite of packages, which are absolutely stunning, amazing, and I'll go so far as essential. Like Veeam Recovery Orchestrator, if you're not there, you need to be there, because anytime I speak to someone in the community, it's a go-to. It is always a recommendation. But when we bring it back to the cost savings, we present this major package, this suite And then we start getting the finance teams involved, and they're going, well, hold on. We're really a capex based shop. We can't afford all that, or we can go opex, but we can't really get up to that level. And they start playing with those numbers, and they're a little disjointed from what we get. So for cost savings, really what I like to do is this is our education point to those business folks of saying, all right, taking it beyond the clicks. This is a VBR. This is what it does. Veeam 1, great reports, but a data aggregator. Hey, recovery orchestrator. This is going to bring our automations. This is going to bring our failovers in place. This is that last part of the zip code, getting us to that zero, if you will. While that being said, sometimes there's not money there. And that seems to be the stumbling block. We've stretched our IT budgets so large. But if we do a great analysis in the cost savings and the efficiencies, and we give those finance teams a roadmap to say, okay, phase one, we're going to introduce a VBR strategy. We're going to bring in some reporting behind it, but then we can grow over the next 6 months, 8 months to include that recovery orchestrator. That really helps them see the cost savings there. And really, sometimes I think we feel like insurance salesmen, right? We walk in and we don't necessarily sell Veeam. Some of us, like I don't have SKUs for Veeam. I just provide the support services, but often I'll deal with these finance teams for the cost savings. And I found this little trend that's a little disturbing, but it's been in place for at least a decade. It seems that firms that have not gone through a cyber incident or failure, loss of data, sometimes those finance teams push back hard and win. But when they go through an event, suddenly there seems to be unlimited budgets in there. So we almost start having this doomsday approach in the conversation. And under cost savings, I'd say, I think back to the community, we don't want to be the naysayers and the doomsday patrol, but what we want to do is say, listen, here's your cost savings. If you were down for one more hour, what would that revenue point be to you? Do you see what we could lose? We could hedge that bet easily with a Veeam recovery orchestrator. So it's education under cost savings. For our security assurance, well, really, I mean, this is buzzy and blingy, right? Security. And I go back just a few years ago where security was a siloed team. They were this offshoot of the CIO's office, or not even a direct report. You had CISOs in there, and they were this ivory tower of things we just can't do. We would call them the no group. Every time we want to do something, they say no. But we think the posturing has moved to where they're so symbiotic. And I've worked with several cyber firms throughout the industry and in the Veeam community, and we've noticed this amazing trend. We get along so well together. In fact, how can you have security if you don't have DR? Seriously, if you have an event, you have to bring it back. There's our DR. We have the whole, how do we bring it back if we don't isolate the threat? There's our security. So we really become almost concentric circles, almost like a DevOps model, if you will. And when we go further with our compliances, if we're a NIST shop, we can see right in the life cycle of NIST exactly where Veeam is fitting in. How do you have a NIST strategy without Veeam? It just doesn't work. But one of my favorite ones, and it's not talked about so much, is that whole cyber kill chain methodology. When you look about incident recovery, bring back, and then forensic, there's where Veeam is. I mean, can you imagine leveraging Veeam to bring up a dirty environment, sandboxed, protected to do the forensics? That speaks volumes, and I can't stress that enough. So while I joke around that us CEOs jet set around and watch different news stations and get little cards in those magazines in the back of airplanes saying, security, easy, do it. Let's talk about that in the community as we drive back to cost savings. Security is an easier spend when Veeam is part of your security strategy. That's where you get your dollar. So again, bringing back Veeam beyond the clicks, how do we finance it? How do we pay for it? It's all about educating our folks and working.
You bring up some excellent points. And whenever we're having that security conversation, you start talking about bottom line, either you run into those no people that may not understand that there are compliance and regulations all over the world, that you have to prove you did everything you could do in some type of incident to still be able to produce data that your regulatory have to keep. Now, that being said, cost of downtime also plays a huge factor. How long can you stop having business, and how much business and money are you going to lose for every minute, every hour, or in some cases, weeks of downtime? Can you afford that versus the bottom line for your security solution? And it's a big conversation. You have to prove you did everything you could. Now, this next concept I love because it's all about like Morris's law. Our technology is growing at such an exponential rate that it is super hard to be able to keep up with everything that is expanding in our environments. Jonah, can you give us a little bit of insight on how this solution and this project helps you make sure that you are updated to the most current protection and suites that you can use?
Right. So the idea behind this is I don't have all of the numbers, but to give the audience an idea, the new Veeam Backup and Replication 12.1 release has something like a 24-page what's new document of all the various new features and changes. And that's normal about once or twice a year, but not even just backup and replication, but all of the products. And if I remember right, last month, there were something like 8 or 10 new product releases. So unless you're in and using Veeam full time, it's basically all you do. It can be extremely challenging to maintain and keep up with all of those new changes in your infrastructure. For example, all the new ransomware and malware remediation in 12.1, or even just I've spoken to countless customers that have the Veeam Availability Suite, or that's probably the old name for it with the license changes last year, but they're just using backup and replication, and they don't realize this whole time that they're licensed for other products and they're not getting the full value out of what they're paying for. Like V1 is included with many instances of VBR licenses, and many customers just don't even have V1 installed. So part of the idea of this is how do you get your full cost benefit of the new features and the current features? And at some point, how do you weigh having someone on premises on your staff that full-time keeps up with Veeam and all the new features versus where do you consult the community or the experts? You come into your VASP or your service provider where they have trained experts, VMCEs, VMCAs, V100 members that constantly work in this infrastructure and keep up with these changes, and they can coach you through what to do to keep your environment current and protected against the threats.
Absolutely. And we can't really just run on a this feels right, this doesn't feel right, or what are we going to do next every time we have to do next. It's important to create a process, and that's exactly what you guys have done. You have this 1, 2, 3, 4 process. What do we need to do? Do you want to dive a little bit deeper into these concepts and how they are applied for us, Tom?
Oh, absolutely. And just to go back with the staying current, if we could for a moment, what I think I want to bring it beyond the click is Jonah's talking about those upgrades, if you will, 12.1, next version or of something. I think when we take it beyond the click and we talk about the business side, what we tend to think in the business world is I need to have something. I make a spend for it, I put it in place, and now that is behind me onto my next to-do item. But I think when we talk about staying current, as much changes around in IT, it's always that next system, that next move, storage, blade, cloud. As we do those things, we need to remember that part of staying current is DR is part of our change management. It really comes back to making sure that every change that permeates your environment from your CABs or ECABs, that we bring that back and say, okay, during CAB, let's have a section where we address what is our DR strategy? Do we need an update? And so that's it as well, beyond just the clicking. And yes, I'd love to bring it over to a little bit of the deep dive of our entire process now. So sorry to backtrack on you, Karinne. All right. So as we move into just looking at Veeam, this is one of those areas that I say sometimes obvious is there in front of us, but we don't see it. So we really need a formalized process. Back in my earlier days, I was an ITIL guy. I mean, ITIL before DevOps, and it was really just process, people, process, technology. My wife is a big ITIL person. She'd go back to the three-legged stool back in the day. people, process, tech. So here we've developed a process to help folks to just, where do we begin with this? And so this will apply to, I don't have a solution, even to, I currently have a Veeam solution. In fact, I might have the biggest and greatest, best Veeam system in place. This should be done quarterly, if not more often. So first, when we get into it, listen, we're going to evaluate and look at the existing Veeam solution or what we're doing today and ask, is it really working for us? When we look at this, we want to document. This is the dreaded documentation world. We need to know every facet of our environment. And we're looking at, how does our mail system work? Are we on-prem Exchange? Are we in M365? Do we have a transition to go in place? How are people accessing different software suites, on-prem, cloud, etc.? And we really spend more time in here documenting. We understand our infrastructure. We understand our secondary and tertiary locations. We understand the capabilities of our storage arrays. Do they immute for us? Do they not immute? So think of this as your information gathering point. You're just going to do a whole bunch of data collection. You're going to throw it in there. If you want to think about it, it's almost like a mind map of your entire organization. But it drives beyond just the clicks here, if you'll notice. I'm not saying look at just your Veeam jobs, because you should do that. And we'll get into point two of where we're kind of doing that gap. But what we're doing is saying, not only just on my technical side, business side, what must I do to deliver my business? And I'll give you a little example as we look in here. There are times in my career where I worked in legal spaces. And legal spaces, it's all about your billing. I know it sounds obvious because some of us have dealt with lawyers, love them, but it's all about billing. Every minute counts. So that's our uptime versus downtime. But when we look at it from a technical standpoint and we're drilling through, we might look at things like invoicing systems, accounts receivable. How often do I get this money? If I speak to the accounts receivable team, they'll tell us that's the most important system and it must be up immediately. But when we look at the overall business, we start looking and saying, wait, as long as we're incrementing and billing and tracking that, we're not necessarily losing revenue. The finance teams would tell us, well, it might increase our accounts receivable time if that other system was down longer. Right, but dollars and cents we haven't lost. So that's where we have to understand what's our business. So even in here, when we evaluate our existing Veeam solution or new Veeam solution, it's interviewing with stakeholders to understand what each of those teams do and deliver from an app delivery standpoint, to a business standpoint, then up to the executive teams where maybe they can weigh in on some priorities. So think about that. This is an interview of your entire organization. As we start looking at step number 2, gap analysis, we take what we looked in step number 1, and we defined out really what our business practices should be. We start looking at the tech now. Now we really look at, how are those jobs configured? Do we have backup jobs? Do we have replication jobs, CDP? Do we have other locations? And we start bringing it back down. Where are our gaps? Okay, what do we have in place? One of the big things I see is the lack of stacking of jobs. Everybody gets so hot on a quick RTO, RPO. We need to replicate, we need to CDP. And then as we start looking at gaps, we go, well, what do we do if we're looking at it from a security standpoint? Are we bringing in those traditional backup jobs to leverage some of those immutabilities and whatnot in there? Start looking at those gaps. But performance-wise as well, I don't know how many times we've spoken in the community that engineers have designed their Veeam strategy around the tech. What can my job do? And they've never realized from a stakeholder perspective, well, what's a reasonable recovery time? This is where we start kind of taking tech versus the initial step 1 to find those gaps. Once we kind of put them together, we do get kind of this remediation area, things we must correct or gaps that we're seeing. And that's where we're kind of looking at step number 3. All right, we've now gathered, we've now gapped. What are we really going to do in the analysis to troubleshoot and fix? Now, we're not necessarily implementing the fix here, people should know. This is more of your documentation roadmap. Remember, going back to cost savings. How could I pay for this in dollars and time? So this is creating your plan. This is, do I need some more sockets? Do I need some more proxies? Do I need some more jobs? And I start kind of rectifying the gap to step number one. And then finally, we deliver a plan. This is really important. And I know I've struggled with this in the environment over the years. I know when I was a younger man, they used to kind of call me the cowboy of IT. You just get in there and just do it. Shadow IT, you get it done. Well, bringing Veeam beyond the click is we have to show some of the cost savings and cost spending in there. If we just fix something and it's not documented, bad day. Undocumented change, that's a no-no. However, we need to help justify our budgets of what we're doing during the day, so to speak. I know it's sad, but time is money. That's where we're going with it. And when we can present a cohesive package plan to the executive teams, suddenly we'll take Veeam into that budget area of being able to pay for it. And we'll start seeing, instead of our DR strategy of just being something else that's spent, we're really going to see the executive teams realize that this is a cost benefit. And they get excited about doing these things, to where if you do steps 1 through 4 properly, you'll often find as somebody decides to build another system, get another app, they're automatically having this conversation in the back of our mind. How will we keep it up? What will we do? And it becomes a part of the initial purchase price of their new app. Just imagine that out there in the community. Somebody goes to buy something new, and instead of you having to protect it with money you don't have, they're now incorporating that into their initial spend. That's spectacular, and that's why I love this process. But until we do what I think is the obvious, obvious is breaking down 1, 2, 3, 4. So this is our process to do it.
So, Tom, when you walk into any meeting, this is a great concept, but what are 2 questions that you ask in every meeting that helps get this conversation started on the right track?
Well, it depends which group I'm talking to, but the question's the same. First of all, I feel like Dr. Phil. I'm like, how is this going for you? Before we get into anything, we talk about the emotional state of it. I have a little psychology I did in my master's and whatnot, and you find that when you talk about the emotion of how is it going, they kind of get a little emotional hijacked. The business side's like, we never know if it's working. And the tech side's like, oh, it works great, but these are our challenges. So first and foremost, it's like, let's have a therapy session. How's that going for you? You'll get a lot of that in there. Second, I ask for any documentation they have, from topography maps to storage maps to even just business process maps. Like, what do you have documented so we can cull through that to start finding some of those gaps? And often, in this arena, we find a lot of people do we started, but we didn't. So we actually have to bring them back to do more homework. So how do you feel and what do you have are the 2 questions I ask.
So, talking about homework, our next section is about the pre-analyst. So, no matter what you do in IT in your life, if you do decide to go see a therapist, there's always going to be this pre-analysis stage, and it really sets the stage for how the rest of the interaction is going to go and if you're going to be on the right footing. Jonah, can you give us a little bit of insight about what you guys do with the pre-analysis stage of this entire project?
Right. So as Tom was saying before, we want to start off with a stakeholder discussion in main part so we can hear the story, learn the history, because until we know that full story and see the full vision of where the infrastructure is, why it got to where it is now, we can't figure out the future state. So kind of building on what Tom said, you find out what are the business needs. I personally like to ask, a little more specifically, well, what's working well right now? What challenges are you currently facing with your implementation, whether that be Veeam or some other backup product, if they're looking to move to Veeam? Are there any particular areas of focus or features that you know of that you'd like to focus on in this? Do you know your business is lacking in, low RPO, low RTO, and you need some tighter times for your critical machines? Then we really start going into a gathering phase, which we'll show some of it here in a little bit with the demo, but you get a little more into the technical side, maybe start meeting with the backup and security and infrastructure engineers. You go through and do some infrastructure assessments to learn for both production and the backup environment, kind of what's the current state of things. And that's kind of where we talk about the story. We continue to build the story. So, why was something done in production or on the backup server the way in which it was done? Maybe, a common one I see is the Veeam components are put on the production domain when typically the best practice is a separate work group or domain for those components for that extra layer of resiliency. But sometimes that's done because maybe when it was implemented, it wasn't really thought about. Other times, maybe there's a specific business case or business need as to why that server's domain joined. Like one I encountered recently is a customer that's actually using multiple backup solutions. So they're bringing Veeam into their infrastructure. They want to use it for offsite backups. But in production across multiple offices, they're actually using native Hyper-V replication across multiple Hyper-V hosts for extremely low near CDP RPOs and RTOs. And in this design, they basically wanted to use Veeam to not back up the primary production copy, but actually perform backups of one of the Hyper-V replicas. And the challenge in that was, how do you perform Veeam backups when Hyper-V is performing its checkpoints every 30 to 60 seconds without you having any sort of checkpoint or VSS conflicts? So in that case, if I remember right, we essentially had to have the Veeam server domain joined because we had to run the backup service itself on a domain account in order to run some custom pre and post job scripts that could automatically disable and re-enable the native Hyper-V replication whenever the Veeam jobs kicked off. Which you see a lot as, especially with some of the new 12.1 features, why doesn't Veeam immediately give you a way to one-click remediate a best practice recommendation? And that's why, because sometimes just clicking it and remediating it isn't the best fix for your organization. Sometimes you knowingly take some security risks in order to enable some other function of the software. So that's where building that story helps us get the full picture and determine what recommendations should be made for the future state. And it really goes beyond those logs, the reports, the basic information gathering to get all of that, because you're never going to get that human factor in that story from a log or a report. And from there, Tom kind of mentioned figuring out some RTOs and RPOs when talking to executives and shareholders. And you do have to define that, but something we often see too is a lot of cases people think about, how do I restore this one application, or how do I restore this one server? As businesses are growing and getting more complicated and we're seeing a need for higher uptimes and redundancy, that's becoming more than just a single application. It's almost becoming more an application pool. Like maybe you're running your website and it's not going to be just one or two servers like it used to be back in the day, especially as your business grows. It's not going to be, say, an all-in-one WordPress server with a proxy and cPanel on it. You might have multiple proxy servers acting in high availability, multiple websites, and on the back end, a separate cluster running your databases in order to give you that high availability. And when you're designing and modernizing and optimizing your backups, you have to make sure that you're thinking about the protection from that application pool standpoint and not a single server or device.
Great. And I do have one question for you, and this is actually about the stakeholders. How do you define who the stakeholders are? What stakeholders do you look for? And how do you handle each of those different groups? Because a lot of this just depends on who you're talking to, what you're going to gather.
Right. So really, if you go back to basic project management, a stakeholder is really anyone that's affected by the project. So your end users, your engineers that are maintaining it, your customers that might be affected by an outage, your executives, and each and every one of them are going to have different requirements and expectations, which is where you kind of have to classify each of your different stakeholder categories. And like Tom said, depending on which group you're asking the questions to, you may ask different questions or prioritize things differently.
I think you also have to go back to the executive teams as well. When we meet with somebody that is really in charge or using an app, they think it's the most important thing in the world. And you have to defer back to the business side, unfortunately. While I may love my email, so to speak, or my iPhone and some of those interactions and mobility messaging, the reality is going back to that loss scenario, is it more important for me to get an email on my phone, or is it important to have billing metrics in place? When you move that conversation into the executive arena, what I love is they'll actually say, well, they're actually one and the same. And you'll say, well, what? Be like, well, every email that's received and answered is a billable item and trackable. So we actually need to move that up. Whereas if I'm maybe in a manufacturing arena and those manufacturers are loading their factory floors 2 weeks out with orders, they actually have larger gap times to be down. So while it's an inconvenience, as long as the factory floor is moving, we push those up. The folks to make those decisions are that executive team. So when we have these conversations, it definitely is subsets of groups. Even if there's executives in the room, in general with a system, we'll always pull back the C-suite or whoever's in charge of that, the V's or the D's, and we'll say, okay, we've met with all of these people. Now, who would you recommend as the point of contact for this area? And how would you make that decision? And then we find that often those folks have to go back to their peers and start kind of understanding how they're going to sort it out. Once we answer these questions, then we can build it better. And I think that's what we're getting at here. There's so much knowledge in the data. And as we gather the data and ask the questions, we don't have to redo things all along the way. Whereas we just hip shoot, throw Veeam in, make something up, put everything on an hour SLA, we find recoverability becomes so challenging when you're talking about 1,000 servers. And while we can do it, look at how we're taxing our resources. Really, there should be a plan in place. And I think that's where Jonah's getting with that. So to answer your question, it's really a multi-tiered conversation.
So just to clarify for all of those that live in an acronym heavy environment like I do, D's and V's, so like your VPs and directors. But even more than finding your right stakeholders, it's just as important to use the right tools. I can't tell you how many short videos I've seen someone using a drill to hammer in a nail. That's going to probably work, but it's not going to give you the result that's really meaningful to your environment. And we have a lot of tools available. Some of these will be within the demo, but do you have any short descripts that you would like to give over some of these tools, use cases before we hop into the demo here?
Well, I just want to say I'd like to start with Veeam, and that's why you see it first on the slide, because like I said before, a lot of people are licensed for Veeam already with their backup and replication installation and may not even realize it. And going in and helping someone analyze their environment, it has a lot of great reports and dashboards out of the box, not just even for the backup infrastructure, but also for production. So an example I like to give people, I would hope this would never happen in production, but I do have a home lab. I like to tinker. And the very first time I installed Veeam in it back in the day, I noticed I was seeing a correlation between some Veeam alarms saying I was having high data store latency on certain data stores, while backups were also running. And it ended up leading me down this rabbit hole where I learned when I had first set up my storage server, one of my disk arrays I had accidentally configured as RAID 0 rather than RAID 5 or RAID 6 like I had intended. So it was causing all sorts of performance issues when backups were running because it was causing high latency and stuns on those production machines in the lab.
Do you want to cover any of the other terms or any of the other products here before we hop into the demo, or do you want to hop directly into that demo for us, Jonah?
I will just say, I'll just throw in Recovery Orchestrator real quick because it's not in the demo, and I know Tom has brought it up a couple times and it's here. That's a great tool, not just for planning your disasters and having everything pre-planned and pre-scripted and ready to go, but also for testing. So when we talk about defining RPOs, RTOs, and SLAs during these reviews, a big part of that is not just defining them, but actually going through and testing, can I actually meet those RPOs and RTOs? And the great thing about Recovery Orchestrator is you can build it during your analysis, use it to perform your test and verify you're meeting those, and then set up some automated scheduling to ensure you're regularly meeting those metrics and be ready for a quick recovery during a disaster.
I want to piggyback on that if I can. Again, driving back, I swear this is like my favorite product in the suite. And it's kind of the third one, right? You have to have VBR, you have to have Veeam to have Veeam Recovery Orchestrator. But whenever I talk to a customer or I talk to someone in the community, I'm very clear. Veeam is not a solution without Recovery Orchestrator. It has to be in your roadmap to get it there. You need some scripting, some automation, and folks, Veeam Recovery Orchestrator is where it's at. So if you have a Veeam solution, you have to think about getting that in there. It is just so paramount. I mean, every single conversation. I think you asked me 2 questions, Karinne. The third question would be, what do? Do you automate? And the answer is usually, well, we'd like to. Well, let me introduce this product. And they're like, what? We didn't know this existed, which is strange to me, but that's how important it is. Make it number one. Look at that pretty screen coming up for our demo. I think it's about that time, huh?
Absolutely. You've got to show them what we're talking about. Now, before we get into this, I just want to pose out there, if anyone's got any questions or wants to see anything specific, definitely hop in that chat and let us know. They're feeding us on the back end, and we always love to answer your questions live. All you, Jonah.
All right, so kind of how we started with Veeam 1 on that last slide, I'm going to start with Veeam 1 for the demo. So this is the web console for Veeam 1. It's installed on a backup and replication server just for the purposes of this demo. Usually the recommendation would be a separate machine for it, but once I launch 12.1, you can see I immediately have a new Veeam Threat Center, which gives me some various metrics to ensure I'm meeting my RPOs on machines. Are my backups immutable? Have I detected any suspicious malware inside of my backups? And are my jobs completing successfully? From there, I can build some of my own custom dashboards. I don't have any right now, but there are some out of the box. So you can see here's Veeam backup and replication. We can go in and see just at a quick state whether the components are healthy or not. Some metrics on how long backups are taking, which, that's another component that people don't really consider when they're talking about RPO and RTO. It's not just how often do I back up, but how quickly do those jobs take to run? Because if I'm on a 24-hour RPO, I don't necessarily want an 8 or 10-hour backup job to be running. I want it ideally down to a few hours or maybe even less. So that's something to look at when you're looking at your infrastructure. I can also go in and run some reports. And the great thing about these reports is, again, Veeam 1 is not just for your backup infrastructure. It's for your M365 backups as well, but also production. So for example, on the backup side, I can go into Veeam backup capacity planning, and out of the box, I can automatically do some capacity planning for my repositories. So I can analyze my data growth and I can future state plan to ensure I don't run out of space for my backups. And you can set these to automatically run on a schedule as well. In this case, we're just previewing some of these reports, so they're going to generate on the fly. We'll come back to that one. On my production side, I have some similar capacity planning. I can predict host failures. I can see how long until I'm over provisioned on some of my physical resources. And I can even go in, this is one of my favorite reports inside of Veeam 1. vSphere optimization is, I believe, where it is. So number one, you have orphaned VM snapshots. Let's say for some reason, Veeam fails to remove a snapshot on a job run, or someone takes a snapshot to perform maintenance and fails to delete it when they complete the maintenance. This report will tell you, hey, you've got a snapshot that's older than a certain number of days on this machine. You might want to go and delete that because it could cause performance issues or even potentially crash your data store. And undersized VMs is another favorite one of mine, as well as oversized VMs, just for some right sizing of your production resources. It'll look at your average resource consumption inside of a VM and tell you, hey, your password vault doesn't need as many CPUs and as much RAM as you've assigned it, but your proxy server over here for Veeam is undersized and needs some additional resources. Veeam 1 also has a great number of alarms out of the box, again, for backup and replication, M365, and your virtual infrastructure. So we'll get into this one here more in a little bit because this kind of gets into some of the 12.1 we're going to show off in backup and replication, but you can even just see immediately we have a warning about some security and compliance. If I go over to M365, I don't have any open alarms right now, but I can at a glance view some of those metrics that were in the web portal on my proxies, the used space, job run status. And virtual infrastructure has a number of alarms as well. Like I said, one that I've seen personally is, hey, your machine or your data store in production is over a certain latency threshold. you have some sort of stun going on somewhere that's impacting your production performance. My favorite part of 12.1, I will say, kind of in 12, but really expanded in 12.1, is the security and compliance analyzer. So this is a whole list of, for your backup infrastructure and the Veeam backup and replication product itself, best practices that are typically recommended. So, here's the 3-2-1 rule. Here's some MFA and some immutability and air gapping. Here's some protocols in Windows you might want to disable or lock down for some extra security. And you can set these up to analyze regularly on a schedule and email you the results too. So let's say someone goes in and, as an example, let's say I go and I disable SSH on my hardened Linux repository. Maybe someone else goes to enable it to install some package updates and run some regular reboots and Windows updates and forgets to disable it again when they're done. Well, then theoretically, if I set this to run once a day and analyze, then after about a day of SSH being turned back on, I'll see, hey, this doesn't pass anymore. We need to go in and remediate this. But like I was saying before, all of these are going to be manual remediations, because having a one button click that remediates these for you is not necessarily the best solution depending on your infrastructure, because every environment is different. I gave the example earlier, but something else that I see in here. So deprecated versions of SSL and TLS should be disabled. Someone may look at that and go, oh, we should disable those. But something you might need to consider with that a script's not going to necessarily do for you is, hey, what if my Veeam server is running on an older OS release? Maybe it's still on 2012 R2 and it doesn't support the latest TLS protocols. Or by disabling those older protocols, because it's an older OS, I'm going to break something else. That's where you'd really need the manual remediation and the discussion of, well, how do we approach this best? Is this a risk we're willing to take for our security right now? Or do we look at maybe an in-place OS upgrade or migrating the Veeam server to a newer OS and then disabling these protocols? Because like I said, every environment is different. So you don't necessarily want to have any sort of auto remediation in place for these checks. You just want to be aware of what they are, so you know whether or not you should look at them. It's essentially risk management in this, and analysis. And just real quick, I'm not going to show them off, but I will give some quick shout outs. Veeam has all these great out of the box tools, but there are some great community members too that have built some wonderful reports. So there's a Veeam employee on GitHub that has the Veeam Health Check tool that gives a great number of reports, though my preference between the two is actually the as-built report. I'm specifically showing VBR here, but there is actually one for VB365 for both of these as well. Because, we talk a lot about VBR. We don't really talk as much about the other products, just because it seems like a lot of people's focus is still that traditional backup and recovery for your on-prem or your public cloud. So this doesn't just apply to backup and replication, but also your M365 and your public cloud.
Jonah, with part of Veeam 1, one of the things that I love about it, especially when we talk about cloud providers, is a whole managed service provider console. And looking at the current version, it now brings Veeam 1 alarms and alerts up into it. So when we talk about that whole concept of getting it right on premises, if you're a service provider and you haven't looked at the managed service provider console, you're missing something immensely. But even better, if you're using it and not incorporating in Veeam 1, you're just opening your customers up to risk. Imagine if you had a cloud business out there and you could actually say, hey, we're seeing some data change alarms coming in place from Veeam 1, which you talk about your favorite reports, that's mine. Why is my data changing so much? And if it ramps substantially over time, well, sometimes it's just maybe Patch Tuesdays coming up and we see a data dump. But I'll tell you what, there's a handful of customers that we watch this alert actually tell us that there was already malware worming its way through the environment, encrypting things. Why would I ever know about that from Veeam 1? That's why it's so powerful. And when you were showing the VBR and the whole security and compliance monitor, I want to echo what you're saying. And you're right. You make the decisions based off of your environment, what's in there, and it's unique. But look at it this way. At least you're making an educated decision now. It's very hard if you're not a Veeam person in the community working with it day in and day out, but maybe you're a generalist. You're overseeing your entire company's infrastructure, and DR is just 1/10 of what you do. Back before this, you really had to study and know what you didn't know before it was too late. Now, at least there's a generated list that can be updated by Veeam as they see fit. So at least you have the major gotchas in there. They're there fighting for you, just reducing that risk on your side. And like you said, it could be in your infrastructure. It might not even be on the Veeam side. It could be that SSH into that Linux hardened repository. So another tool, if I said that VRO was absolutely, or Veeam Recovery Orchestrator was paramount to your Veeam, well, the good news is Veeam 1 has to go with it. And there's so much information over here. And I know, Jonah, you've seen the same thing I have. For some reason, people buy this product and they never even open it. It's shocking to me.
They never even install it in a lot of cases, let alone open it.
So there are so many reports that we have here inside of the product, but Jonah, you made us a 5 bullet point list here of some of the top reports that you recommend people looking at. Can you give us a brief reason as to why someone should check these reports first before some of the other reports that you've shown off?
Right. So this is a combination of kind of tying things together that we've already talked about, taking your story, taking your infrastructure assessment and bridging them. So look at your protected application pools. And so how are you protecting those application pools? A recommendation we see that's not often implemented is create VMware tags or Hyper-V tags. Every application pool gets a specific tag, and that tag gets added to a job. So as you add or remove components from that application pool, they're automatically protected in your backups. So many people these days are still just manually adding machines to their backup jobs rather than utilizing tagging, which is there and relatively easy to set up. Guest processing, that's another big one. Not to just enable some file restores and some application-aware features for your granular database restores, but also your guest file indexing. So if you do need to go do a file level restore, maybe you get some quicker browsing in the Explorer, or especially with 12.1, it enables some of that additional malware detection capabilities with the inline scanning if you're also indexing. Custom scripting, like I said, that can be a number of things. It's going to depend on your infrastructure. So there was the Hyper-V example I gave earlier. But maybe there's also some sort of like, hypothetically, maybe I write my backups as a copy to a scale-out repository, and that scale-out repository writes to a capacity tier offsite somewhere with S3 storage, and I'm bringing in Recovery Orchestrator. Well, I don't just want to test my on-prem backups, I want to test those offsite backups as well. So how can I use custom scripting in conjunction with the Veeam products to maybe recover and perform RPO and RTO tests off of those S3 backups rather than only the on-prem backups? And then the last two are just things we see relatively often, mainly file servers and databases that tend to be the most impactful to meeting RPO and RTO. So large VMs and or IO intensive VMs. If you didn't know, there's some limitations or at least best practices around how large a backup chain should be, a full backup. And we see in a lot of cases where maybe someone has hypothetically like a 30 terabyte Oracle database or a 20 terabyte file server. And in some cases that can cause a lot of processing issues for Veeam, in part because of limitations of what a single CPU core and concurrent task can do at once. But if we talk to an organization and we work to maybe break those machines up into a larger pool of multiple servers, well, then we have more concurrent tasks available to us, and we might be able to process that same amount of data in a much shorter period of time because of the scalability of multi-threaded performance with multiple tasks running at once for a backup or restore.
We've had a lot of content that we've had to get through on this cast today. Just to kind of wrap up here, could you give us some insights on next steps, where to take it from here for us, Tom?
Oh, absolutely. And just so we know what this graphic represents, this is kind of just a summary of what we saw in those 4 points that I introduced before. Artifacts is our gathering, Veeam configuration, remediation, next steps. This is so great that we bring this up at the end because, again, we don't want shadow IT in just to fix things. We want to make sure we're maintaining our change management. We're doing our budget cycles. The last thing we ever want is just something sprung upon us. So next steps to take. If I were to speak a little bit of where Jonah was with his Veeam 1, we find many people in the sales cycle, be it cloud or on premises, that in the community that just kind of use the law of averages. Well, we think most implementations take this, and we don't want to slow down our sales cycles or our implementation cycles because we need everything done yesterday. In these next steps, when we use something like Veeam 1, we're doing a little bit more of planning and preparation beforehand, and we're making that true roadmap and design. So those next steps we take is say, wow, we can see that we're not testing things. Let's go ahead and look at a Veeam Recovery Orchestrator, or maybe we have a Veeam Recovery Orchestrator and we can find out, well, we're not doing any custom scripts on here. When we boot into something, do we need to check something besides an open port in there? If we look at things such as encryption states, we can look at different designs in there. We make the roadmap. More often than not, our next steps, believe it or not, I would say are probably about 15% Veeam related and 85% production or secondary infrastructure related. And what I mean is the right sizing concepts. Do we need somewhere to fail this over a little more efficiently? Do we need some more horsepower to get something done quicker? And until we do that analysis, we don't really know. So your next step is, this is your business proposal. I spent good part of Q3 and more so in Q4 of working with different people in the community to say, okay, they want to do something in 2024. When we did steps 1, 2, and 3, we produced step number 4, and we were able to give that to their business decision makers, and suddenly budget monies were in place that made for a happier work environment and actually getting things done because they made the business case justification. It was stamped, funds were allocated, and now that we're in January, people are out there running to just get these things in place. So that's how important it is. Take it beyond the click. This is where we're going. It's not just clicking through Veeam 1. It's not just your VBR. It's not just saying this is the SKU I need. It's understanding the people, the process, and the technology and the true cost. So when we go forward, we look like we're good stewards of our environment and our budgetary dollars. And that brings credibility to us beyond just being really, really smart people in Veeam, which we all are. The community is wonderful. But we've got to bring it back to the business side, and that's what we're staying here in next steps. This is a plan. This is what we will do. And then once it's approved, move into your Agile or your Scrum or your DevOps, whatever methodology you have to bring those changes in place, but you will have done your business case. And that's where we are, unlocking peak performance, getting what you need, having it paid for, and implementing it and being protected.
So if this was not enough for you and you want more content, I highly encourage heading over to our community.veeam.com, where these guys live on a daily basis, answering questions, looking at topics, posting in different thematic groups. And beyond even that, Jonah and Tom will be joining us for Veeam this year, and I have a special discount, which is the first discount we'll be offering out to everyone, which will be available for the entire life cycle all the way up until D-Day for Veeam, which is Ricatron 10, which will give you 10% off at Veeam. Now, just to completely wrap up here, Jonah, could you give us a 30-second walk away? If no one walks away with anything but this, what should they know?
Veeam can be a lot to handle. Consult the community, ask the experts. You won't ever know everything.
Perfect. Tom, do you have a 30 seconds to walk away with for us?
I do. I will go back to just how we handle anything in the community. I say open your support case, get a ticket logged. Eyes are looking at it. Use the community. Guess what? The developers and product teams are all throughout there. Veeam is the first company I've ever been with where those sorts of people are really looking at those forums. Use them. You will gain a wealth of information in there.
Now, from all of us here in the V100 community, I appreciate you joining us today, and I hope you have a great rest of your week, weekend, and anyone watching the recap, enjoy our content.
In a world of increasing cyber threats and smarter cyber criminals, be radically resilient. Introducing Veeam Data Platform 23H2 Update, built on Zero Trust architecture and with AI-powered threat detection, proactive threat hunting, SIM systems and ServiceNow integration, and Yara content analysis. Plus, Veeam's new Threat Center helps identify risks to your environment in a simple, powerful security scorecard. The Veeam Data Platform includes backup and recovery, monitoring and analytics, plus recovery orchestration. Learn more at vee.am/what's new and achieve radical resilience.